The Candlemaker's Curse, Part 2. Chapter 9, Baptized in Fire. Fire tore through the chamber, searing heat licking at the air, swallowing the walls in an inferno of red and gold. The ancient runes carved into the obsidian stone screamed with light, their magic twisting into something living, something bound to an ancient will that had been waiting for him. The moment the flames erupted, Sylas moved, his instincts driving him forward, his mind already adapting, already calculating. His magic coiled against his ribs, burning beneath his skin, aching to be released, but Cassiel's trap was still wound tight around him, the suppression lingering like heavy chains. His vision blurred for half a second before sharpening again, his muscles coiled, his boots skidding against the stone as the floor beneath him fractured. Cassiel was gone. The air where he had stood shimmered with heat, a whisper of power left behind, a vanishing trick meant to shift the battlefield to his terms. Sylas's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together as he took stock of his surroundings, eyes scanning the ruin as the inferno roared. The temple, if it had ever truly been one, was breaking apart. Pillars cracked and crumbled, stones suspended midair by unnatural forces before shattering into nothingness, consumed by the ever-growing flames. The magic here was corrupt, twisted, binding itself to the space, warping it into something unrecognizable. The world was shifting around him, and Sylas knew, this was Cassiel's doing. His mark burned against his wrist, mocking him. The thread had led him here, had dragged him into Cassiel's domain. The question was this a trap meant to kill him, or something else entirely? His instincts told him the latter. If Cassiel had truly wanted him dead, the ritual chamber would have been built to collapse, to consume him in a finality of stone and fire, a simple ending to a long game. But Cassiel wasn't interested in simple endings. He never had been. Sylas exhaled slowly, his breath steady despite the rising heat. His mind was already working, already unraveling the spellwork layered through the room. The fire was not pure destruction. It was a barrier. A seal. Something woven into the ritual that had been waiting to activate. Which meant, there was something else here. Something hidden. Something Cassiel wanted him to see. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he traced the flickering embers against the walls. The fire was behaving strangely, not wild, not chaotic. It was moving with purpose. Spiraling. Swirling. Carving symbols into the air itself. Sylas stepped forward, his boots crunching against what little remained of solid ground, his magic humming at the edges of its bindings, waiting for an opening. And then, he saw it. At the center of the collapsing chamber, past the twisting flames and broken stone, stood an altar. Not untouched by the fire, but preserved within it. The flames coiled around it, wrapping the jagged black rock like a living thing, shifting in a perfect circle. The runes along the altar's base pulsed with the same ashen glow that burned beneath Sylas's skin, and his stomach turned. This was the heart of the ritual. The heart of Cassiel's betrayal. And at its center, a candle. Sylas's breath caught, his body going still. Not because it was unexpected. Not because it was unfamiliar. But because he knew it. The wax was dark, deep crimson threaded with black veins, its surface scarred as if burned too many times, as if it had been lit, extinguished, relit, extinguished again, an endless cycle of suffering. And within it, trapped beneath its twisted layers of magic, a soul. Sylas felt his chest tighten, his magic thrash beneath his skin. No. He knew this candle. Because he had seen it before. Because he had touched it before. Because it was Leora's. A slow exhale left his lips, his fingers twitching, his entire body on the edge of action, barely holding himself together. He had walked into Cassiel's trap without realizing it. He had spent years chasing ghosts, following dead trails, believing Leora had been lost to the Candlemaker, when all along, she had been here. In Cassiel's hands. Burning. Rage crawled through his bones, but he did not move forward yet. Not yet. He was a warlock, not a fool. This was too easy. Too intentional. If Cassiel had gone through the effort of keeping Leora's soul bound in wax, had hidden her within layers of rituals and ruin, then he would not have left her unguarded. Which meant, this was another test. Sylas clenched his jaw, inhaling slowly through his nose, assessing. The candle pulsed in the flames, untouched but not unaffected. The sigils along its wax were shifting, moving, breathing, as though something inside was stirring. Leora. She was here, her essence, at least. But was she aware? Did she know he had come? Or had she been burned away too many times to remember? A flicker of movement in the flames, and then Cassiel's voice. You were always too sentimental, Sylas. Sylas did not turn. He did not give Cassiel the satisfaction of reacting. He kept his gaze on the candle, his body poised, his magic waiting for the first opening, for the first crack in the bindings Cassiel had woven around this moment. A slow clap echoed through the chamber, Cassiel's footsteps following, unhurried, calculated. You walked the path I set for you, he mused. You followed the breadcrumbs. But you still don't understand, do you? He exhaled softly, as if disappointed. This isn't about Leora. Sylas's grip tightened. No, he murmured. It's about you. Cassiel chuckled, low and knowing. You're learning. Sylas turned then, slowly, deliberately, eyes locking onto Cassiel's with icy precision. The inferno roared around them, but he ignored it. The runes pulsed, but he did not waver. Cassiel stood at ease, his expression one of calm certainty, as if everything had already played out in his favor. But Sylas knew better. Cassiel was a master of control, of playing the long game, of making sure every piece moved exactly as he intended. Which meant, there was something he was not saying. Sylas exhaled slowly, tilting his head, letting his voice drop into something cold, quiet, sharp as a blade pressed against the throat. You didn't keep her to stop me, he murmured. You didn't even keep her for power. His eyes narrowed. You kept her because you wanted me to come for her. Cassiel smiled. And now, here you are. Sylas's chest tightened. The game had never been about Leora. It had always been about him. The candle pulsed again, brighter. The flames twisted. The magic in the room changed. And then, Leora screamed. A voice not dead. Not gone. Alive. Sylas moved. The fire collapsed inward. And the war began. Chapter 10, The Warlock's Reckoning. The scream tore through the chamber, a sound that did not belong to the living, but neither did it belong to the dead. It was something trapped between, something fractured, something that had been burning too long and too often, the echoes of its suffering woven into the fabric of the ritual itself. Sylas did not hesitate. He moved. Magic pulsed in his veins, thrashing against the suppressive weight Cassiel had bound around him, but he did not fight it. Not yet. Instead, he let it build, let it coil, let it rage beneath his skin like a storm waiting to break. The runes lining the floor flickered red-hot, ancient sigils snapping to life as the inferno spiraled inward, converging on the altar, on the candle, on the single, fragile thing that had been reduced to a prison for the soul inside. Leora. The flames twisted, shifting in unnatural movements, patterns of control, of containment, Cassiel's work. Sylas's eyes flicked to him, standing just beyond the circle, his dark robes unmoving despite the force of the storm he had created. He was not worried. That alone told Sylas everything. Cassiel had planned for this. Cassiel had been waiting for this. Cassiel was still in control. Sylas forced the fury back, forced himself to think. His enemy was a strategist, a warlock who had never taken a step without ensuring that it would lead to his desired outcome. That meant the candle, the ritual around it, was more than a prison. It was a game piece. The final piece in a puzzle Cassiel had been arranging for years. Sylas's gaze snapped back to the candle. If he made a mistake, if he broke the wrong seal, if he tried to shatter the bindings without understanding them, he could lose her. A second scream. This time, he heard it clearly. A voice he had not heard in years, a voice that had once been laughter, sharp and reckless, unburdened by the weight of power and consequence. Sylas, the sound was distorted, fractured through the layers of magic suffocating it, but it was her. Leora. Trapped. Still burning. His magic lashed out in response, instinct overpowering reason, but Cassiel's sigils tightened. The moment his power flared, the red runes on the stone flared with it, shifting, curling, absorbing the energy, feeding on it. A binding trap. A mirror spell designed to use his own magic against him. Clever. Too clever. Cassiel watched, and Sylas knew, he was being tested. Cassiel wanted to see what he would do. Sylas exhaled slowly, forcing his power back under control, waiting, listening. The sigils hummed beneath the stone, their movements precise, measured. They weren't just woven into the floor. They were tethered to the candle. The moment he disrupted them, the ritual would react. But how? Would it consume Leora's soul entirely? Would it ignite a backlash strong enough to take them both? Would it? You're hesitating. Cassiel's voice slid through the fire, smooth, unhurried, amused. Sylas did not respond. He was already studying him, already picking apart the edges of the moment, the angles, the weaknesses. There was always a weakness. I could end this for you, Cassiel continued, his head tilting slightly, watching, waiting. I could undo it all. Free her. No pain. No risk. His lips curled. All you have to do is ask. Sylas's fingers twitched, rage curling low in his gut, but he did not let it break his focus. He knew the game Cassiel played. Always control. Always offering a way out, a hand extended, an illusion of mercy where there was none. You've already taken everything from me, Sylas said, his voice steady, even. Lethal. You don't get to pretend you care how this ends. Cassiel exhaled softly. You always were the most difficult to reason with. Sylas moved. It was a fraction of a second, a sharp flick of his fingers, a single pulse of magic, barely more than a whisper. Not a spell. Not an attack. A test. The energy curled through the air, invisible to the eye, weaving between the runes, between the flames, seeking the edges of the bindings. Cassiel's lips twitched, just slightly, just enough for Sylas to see. And that was it. The weakness. The runes weren't designed to block all magic. They were designed to respond to it. They needed it. They needed power to maintain the bindings, needed fuel to sustain the cycle of destruction and rebirth, needed a warlock to make the first move. Which meant, they were waiting for him. Sylas's jaw tightened. It was a lure. A carefully woven baited trap. He could break the spell. He knew that now. But the cost? Cassiel was watching him with unsettling patience, waiting, letting him process what he had just uncovered. Now you understand, Cassiel murmured, voice soft, almost gentle. The moment you release her, you take her place. Sylas did not flinch. She was never meant to be the end, Sylas. You were. Cassiel's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction, his power coiled around him like something alive, something hungry. You were always the final piece. The flames flickered. The runes pulsed. Sylas stood at the precipice of a decision that had already been made for him. Save her, and take her place. Or walk away, and she burns forever. Cassiel tilted his head, waiting, watching, knowing. Sylas exhaled slowly, his magic curling beneath his skin, bracing. And then, softly, he spoke. Then let's end this. His fingers moved, magic surged. And the flames exploded. Chapter 11, The Flames of the Forsaken. The moment Sylas unleashed his magic, the world broke. Fire surged outward in a shockwave of raw, unrestrained energy, tearing through the runes like shattered glass, ripping through Cassiel's bindings, twisting the air, unraveling the intricate web of control he had woven. The stone beneath Sylas's feet cracked with the force of it, ancient sigils bursting apart in cascades of red and black light, the weight of the ritual collapsing in on itself. The candle at the heart of the altar trembled, the wax pulsing as though something within it was fighting, screaming, clawing to be free. Leora's soul. Still alive. Still burning. The fire raged around him, curling against his skin, but Sylas did not stop. Could not stop. He poured his power into the breaking spell, every thread of energy pushing against Cassiel's trap, against the centuries-old magic designed to ensure that no soul ever escaped its fate. His veins felt like they were made of fire, his bones thrumming with the sheer force of the unraveling, his mind stretched thin between the present and the past, between his own body and the dying echoes of Leora's screams. Too late. He had been too late for so long. But not now. Not this time. Cassiel did not move. He did not react, did not flinch, did not raise a hand to counter Sylas's assault. He simply stood there, a figure of stillness amidst the chaos, his expression unreadable, his silver-lit eyes reflecting the storm as if he had been waiting for it. The smirk on his lips did not fade, nor did the unsettling patience in his gaze. He had seen this moment before, planned for it, accounted for it, wanted it. And that realization twisted in Sylas's gut like a blade. This wasn't a mistake. This was exactly what Cassiel wanted. The binding spell cracked further, the candle trembling violently now, wax dripping in thick, sluggish trails, something deep within shifting, moving, awakening. Sylas felt the shift like a ripple through his soul, the tether between himself and Leora stretching to its breaking point. She was close. She was so close. The ritual was unraveling, the final layers peeling away in a cascade of burning light, and then, a voice. Not Leora's. Cassiel's. You still don't see it, do you? His voice was smooth, quiet, threading through the inferno like a knife gliding through silk. You think this is about her? His eyes gleamed in the firelight, flickering with something far colder than amusement. Something victorious. But it was always about you. The final rune snapped. The spell broke. The candle shattered. Leora's soul, released. The chamber detonated. Power erupted from the altar in a violent explosion of light and darkness, a force that had been kept in torment for too long, its release shaking the very foundations of the ruined temple. The impact threw Sylas backward, his body crashing against the cracked stone, his vision blurred by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of magic surging through the room. The fire twisted wildly, uncontrollably, no longer bound by Cassiel's sigils, no longer following the careful, controlled flow of the ritual. The balance had been destroyed. And at the center of it all, Leora. Her form was not whole. Not yet. Not completely. She was a flickering presence, a soul barely tethered to the physical realm, a shifting silhouette of fire and shadow, her essence caught between the worlds, trying to reform, trying to find her body, trying to survive. Sylas struggled to his feet, his breath ragged, his magic unstable, his vision swimming, but his focus locked onto her, onto the shape barely holding together in the chaos. Leora. His voice cut through the storm, sharp, commanding, filled with desperation and fury. Her head turned. Her eyes found his. Recognition flickered, brief, faint, but real. And then Cassiel moved. It was not a lunge, not an attack, not an act of desperation, it was precise. Effortless. A step forward, a hand lifted, fingers curling, a single shift in the balance of the ritual that should not have been possible. And the world changed. The sigil on Sylas's wrist burned. A sharp, consuming pain tore through his veins, sudden, brutal, searing through his bones, his skin, his soul. The mark reacted. Not in rejection. Not in failure. In completion. Realization slammed into him too late. Cassiel hadn't bound him to Leora's prison. He had bound him to her release. The moment she was freed, so was the cost. The ritual was never designed to keep her burning. It was designed to transfer the fire. Sylas choked back a gasp as the flames coiled around him, as the weight of the binding latched onto him instead, as the magic Cassiel had been weaving for years came to fruition in a single, excruciating instant. "You really thought you were saving her," Cassiel murmured, voice almost gentle. Sylas's knees buckled. His magic was gone. Not broken. Not drained. Taken. Cassiel had not only stolen Leora's chains. He had reforged them. And now, Sylas was bound in her place. The fire consumed. The runes sealed. And Cassiel smiled. "Welcome to your new eternity, Sylas." The world went black. Chapter 12, Bound in Fire. Darkness wrapped around Sylas like a living thing, thick, suffocating, absolute. He could not see, could not move, could not even feel the weight of his own body, only the slow, agonizing pull of the binding tightening around him. Magic curled through his veins like molten iron, an oppressive, searing weight pressing against his soul, sinking into his bones, embedding itself into the very fabric of his being. Trapped. His consciousness felt fractured, stretching in too many directions at once, spiraling through the unseen layers of reality, caught in a space that was neither life nor death, neither flesh nor spirit, a prison made of fire. His senses blurred, shifting between what had once been real and what was now his cursed eternity. The sigil on his wrist, Cassiel's brand, was no longer just a mark. It was a chain. A seal. A consuming, all-encompassing tether that had already begun to reshape him into something less than himself, something different, something that was no longer Sylas Blackthorne but a piece of the ritual itself. And in the distance, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Fading. "Leora." The sound barely reached him, a whisper fraying at the edges, slipping through the cracks of the spell that now bound them apart. She was free. She had been freed. He had done it, he had saved her. But the cost, he had not foreseen the cost. He had assumed the bindings would break, assumed the spell would collapse, assumed Cassiel's game had been about keeping Leora in place. But it was never about that. It had been about the transfer. About replacing her. About him. And Cassiel had won. Sylas fought against the weight of the magic pressing down on him, his instinct screaming, his mind rebelling against the chains that coiled tighter with every second. His magic, where was his magic? He reached for it, tried to summon it, tried to force it through the layers of fire that wrapped around him, but it wasn't there. Not in the way it had been before. It had not been erased. Not destroyed. It had been converted. Rewritten. Changed. The flames pulsed around him, no longer just a barrier, no longer just a prison, they were part of him now. He could feel them shifting beneath his skin, feeding from his existence, shaping him into something else. The knowledge twisted in his gut like a knife. This was what had happened to Leora. This was what Cassiel had done to her. This was what she had endured over and over, through every relighting of the candle, through every flicker of the ritual that had stolen her soul, every rebirth that had reshaped her into nothing but a whisper of who she had once been. And now, it would happen to him. His thoughts spiraled, stretching into the fire, twisting against the suffocating weight of the magic holding him down, searching for a crack, a weakness, a way out. But there was nothing. No loophole. No escape. The ritual had been designed with Cassiel's absolute precision. Cassiel had been planning this for years. Every move Sylas had made, every step he had taken, every choice, Cassiel had known. Had accounted for. Had controlled. From the moment Sylas had started hunting for the truth, the moment he had walked into the Candlemaker's shop, the moment he had touched the first candle, the moment he had chosen to save Leora, it had all been orchestrated. A deep, consuming rage ignited inside him, searing through the spellwork, cracking through the pain, pushing against the weight Cassiel had pressed onto him. No. He would not be another soul left to burn. He would not be reduced to an existence trapped between light and shadow, bound to wax and wick, forced into a cycle of endless suffering. He was Sylas Blackthorne, and he had spent his entire life breaking the rules of magic, shattering the chains placed upon him, defying the inevitability of fate. And he would not stop now. The fire pressed against him, the ritual tightening, shaping, attempting to pull him under, attempting to rewrite him. But something in him resisted. Something inside him snarled against the inevitability of Cassiel's victory, something clawed its way back to the surface, something older. The flames twisted. Shifted. Stirred. And then, something broke. Not fully. Not completely. But a crack. A flicker of darkness wove through the fire, threading between the embers, disrupting the pattern of the binding, something Cassiel had not accounted for. Sylas latched onto it, his consciousness focusing, his mind sharpening, his will igniting with a force even the flames could not smother. His soul may have been bound, but his mind was not. He could still think. He could still fight. And that meant Cassiel had made a mistake. Sylas forced himself deeper into the fire, searching, pushing past the pain, reaching into the layers of magic that bound him here. There had to be something Cassiel had missed. Some edge, some fault, some thread to pull. And then, he felt it. A shadow beneath the flames. A signature. A familiar signature. The Candlemaker. Sylas's breath caught even though he no longer had lungs, even though he no longer had a body in the way he had before. The magic surrounding him, it was not just Cassiel's. The traces of it were unmistakable. The structure of the spell, the way it held him, the way it fed from him, it was not Cassiel's alone. It was the Candlemaker's. Sylas's mind reeled, calculations unraveling at impossible speed. Cassiel had not created this spell on his own. He had not designed the cycle of fire and sacrifice alone. He had help. He had learned from someone. The Candlemaker had taught him. Or worse, the Candlemaker had always been involved. The revelation sent another surge of fury through Sylas, but he forced it down, forced himself to think. If the Candlemaker's magic was here, if his hand had been in the crafting of this ritual, then there was a door. A door only he could open. Because he had already been through the Candlemaker's web once. And survived. The fire coiled tighter, pulling, binding, trying to sink its final hooks into him. But Sylas gritted his teeth, his will snapping into something colder, sharper, stronger. If the Candlemaker had helped create this spell, then the Candlemaker could break it. Which meant Sylas didn't need to escape. He needed to be taken back. He let his mind reach into the magic, twisting his own consciousness into the ashes of the spell, letting himself sink further, letting himself fall into the wax and flame, into the cycle, into the moment just before the fire consumed him entirely. And then he called. Not to Cassiel, but to the Candlemaker. And the darkness around him stirred. The fire flickered. The weight of the binding shifted. And for the first time since the moment he had been trapped, the candle's flame burned black. And a voice whispered back. Clever, warlock. The world shattered. Chapter 13, The Black Flame's Bargain. Darkness ruptured. Fire peeled away like torn fabric, twisting, recoiling, unraveling in slow, curling wisps of wax and smoke. Sylas did not move, could not move, his very essence suspended between existence and oblivion, between the pull of the ritual that still tried to claim him and the whispering force that had answered his call. The flames were different now. No longer Cassiel's controlled inferno, no longer the endless consuming hunger of the spell that had bound Leora for years. This was something else. Something older. Something that did not burn with heat but with cold, something that did not destroy but transformed. The darkness coiled, thick as ink, shifting in tendrils through the flickering red light, and within it, a shape formed. A shape Sylas knew. A shape that should not have been here but was. The Candlemaker. He was not standing, not in the way a mortal being would stand. He emerged, rising from the shifting void like a specter of wax and shadow, his form flickering, his edges blurred, his silver-lit eyes gleaming like molten metal, unblinking, unbothered, unbound by the laws of the world Sylas had always known. The space around him trembled, warped, obeying only him, and when he spoke, the words did not come from his lips but from the air itself, from the fire, from the cold press of something that had already touched Sylas once before. You summoned me. Sylas's breath was ragged, his body still locked in place by the weight of the spell, by the shifting remains of the ritual that had tried to claim him. He could feel Cassiel's magic pressing against him, resisting the intrusion, pushing against the disruption that had not been part of his design. Cassiel had crafted a cage, a prison that was meant to be eternal. But the Candlemaker did not follow Cassiel's rules. He did not obey Cassiel's magic. He was not bound to the ritual. He had been part of it, but he was never controlled by it. Sylas had called to the one thing that did not belong in Cassiel's design. And it had answered. His fingers curled, his teeth clenched, his magic still coiled deep beneath the surface, waiting. He could not break the spell alone. Not yet. Not like this. But the Candlemaker was here. And that meant a deal could be made. Sylas forced his voice to steady, forced his thoughts to lock into place despite the suffocating weight still wrapped around him. You were part of this. The Candlemaker tilted his head, slow, deliberate, his expression unreadable. I am part of many things, warlock. Sylas's jaw tightened. Did you help him craft this spell? A long pause. A silence that pressed against the flames, thick and deliberate. Then, he came to me. Long ago. Seeking what all men seek. Power. Knowledge. The means to shape the world as he desired. A flicker of something crossed the Candlemaker's expression, not regret. Not pride. Simply acknowledgement. I gave him what he asked for. Sylas's blood ran cold, rage curling in his chest, but he kept his voice controlled. You taught him how to bind souls. A slow blink. I taught him how to shape wax and fire. The Candlemaker's gaze flickered toward the crumbling ritual around them, to the collapsing fire, to the remnants of the binding still trying to claim Sylas's soul. What he did with that knowledge was his own choice. As all choices are. Sylas's fingers twitched. Then unmake it. The Candlemaker did not smile, but something in his expression shifted, something deep, something old, something that carried the weight of centuries of deals, of bargains, of whispered exchanges in the dead of night. "Is that your wish?" Sylas's pulse hammered against his ribs. He knew what this was. He knew the price would not be small. He knew there was always a price. Cassiel had designed a spell meant to bind a warlock's soul into an eternity of servitude. If the Candlemaker could unravel it, it would not be free. But Sylas had already given too much. He had already lost too much. He would not let Cassiel take this victory. He would not be bound. His gaze locked onto the Candlemaker's, unwavering, unflinching, as he forced the words past his lips. "Break the binding. Undo it. Free me." A long pause. The weight of the moment settled like cold iron. The Candlemaker's silver eyes gleamed, flickering like the wax-dripped wicks of the thousands of candles that had burned before. His fingers lifted, slow, deliberate, wax-streaked and waiting. "Very well." The moment the words left his lips, the air shifted. The fire around them shuddered, recoiled, twisted. The weight pressing against Sylas's chest snapped, the sigils carved into his skin cracking, breaking, peeling away like dried ink on parchment. The ritual that had been crafted to hold him, the spell Cassiel had spent years shaping, began to unmake itself. The altar trembled, the flickering remnants of Leora's prison burning away, released. The chains woven into the wax, the layers of runes, all of it collapsed in a single, shattering wave. And Sylas felt himself return. His magic rushed back into him like a roaring tide, seeping through every crack in his bones, filling the hollow spaces where Cassiel had tried to take. His veins burned with it, his skin thrumming with it, his mind sharpening as the weight of fire and wax and suffering disintegrated. He gasped, the first breath he had taken that was truly his own since stepping into Cassiel's domain, his body solid again, his soul unchained. And then, the price. The Candlemaker's fingers curled. The deal had been made. And Sylas knew. His head snapped up, his magic flaring, his instinct screaming, but it was too late. The Candlemaker's silver eyes locked onto him, unrelenting. "I gave you what you asked for. Now the balance must be kept." And Sylas felt it, the shift, the weight, the knowledge sinking into him like cold steel. The spell had not just been broken. It had been redirected. The fire did not disappear. The chains did not vanish. The wax did not melt into nothingness. The binding was still intact, that it just no longer belonged to him. Sylas turned sharply, his magic surging, his breath a snarl, and he saw it. Cassiel, frozen. His body locked in place, his fingers twitching, his breath sharp, his eyes wide. The runes had not faded. They had shifted. The sigils that had been carved into Sylas's flesh had rewritten themselves. Onto Cassiel. The air hummed. The fire coiled. And the Candlemaker smiled. "All flames must burn, warlock. Even his." Cassiel screamed. The fire consumed. And Sylas watched. Chapter 14, The Pyre of Betrayal. Cassiel's scream ripped through the air, raw and unfiltered, the sound of a man who had never before known the agony of power slipping beyond his control. The fire did not just burn him, it claimed him, coiling around his body like living chains, binding itself to his flesh, forcing itself into the very marrow of his existence. His hands jerked, fingers clawing at his skin as if he could peel the runes away, as if he could undo what had already been written, but the sigils only burned deeper, searing themselves into him, burrowing into his bones, sealing his fate as Sylas's had once been meant to be sealed. The Candlemaker stood silent and unmoving, watching with an expression of quiet satisfaction, his silver eyes reflecting the flickering light of the curse he had redirected. The balance had been restored, the weight of the ritual shifted onto the one who had tried to wield it for his own ends, and now there was no escape, no undoing what had already taken root. The chains of magic wrapped tighter around Cassiel's body, pulling him toward the shattered remains of the altar, toward the broken candle that had once housed Leora's soul. But now, the flame that burned at its wick was not hers, it was his. It was Cassiel's own essence, siphoned from his body, pulled into the same cycle he had designed for another, a cycle he had been so certain he would control. His lips parted, forming words that never made it past the raw sound of his agony, his knees buckling as the magic forced him down. Sylas watched, his breath steady, his heart hammering, but not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but from the sheer weight of vindication. Cassiel had orchestrated every move, shaped every piece, led him to this moment believing it was his triumph, his final checkmate, but now the board had flipped. The flames surged higher, their color shifting, no longer the deep red of Cassiel's magic but black, cold, unnatural. This was not a fire meant for rebirth. This was a fire meant for consumption. Cassiel lifted his head, his gaze snapping toward Sylas, his eyes wild, desperate, pleading. Not for mercy. Cassiel had never been a man who begged for forgiveness, only for understanding. Sylas met his stare without flinching, without speaking, without offering him the explanation he sought. There was nothing to explain. There was no reversal of what had already been done. This was the consequence of his own creation. Cassiel's lips curled, the faintest trace of a bitter, humorless smile flickering across his face even as the fire tightened its grip, even as the weight of the spell dragged him lower, even as his skin cracked beneath the force of the magic he had once wielded so arrogantly. You always were, unpredictable, he rasped, voice rough, barely more than breath. But you don't understand what you've done. The words carried weight, carried warning, but Sylas refused to give them power. No, he said, his tone even, cold. I understand perfectly. The sigils flashed one final time, pulsing bright, sealing themselves fully, and Cassiel's body convulsed. His eyes snapped wide, his breath caught, and then his form began to shift, to melt, to break apart into embers and wax and shadow, his physical body stripped away layer by layer until only the flame remained. A single, flickering light, contained. Bound. No longer a warlock. No longer a man. No longer anything but fire trapped in the cycle he had forged. The weight of it settled over the chamber, a finality that resonated through the air, through the stone, through the very fabric of the ritual that had once threatened to consume Sylas himself. The candle at the heart of the altar flickered, its wax smooth, untouched, a new prison carved in the wake of the old. Cassiel's soul was now sealed within the very thing he had once used to entrap others, left to burn endlessly in the cage he had created, left to feel the weight of what he had done for as long as the flame endured. Silence followed, thick and oppressive, broken only by the quiet flickering of the cursed candle that now held Cassiel's essence. Sylas exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his limbs for the first time, feeling the sheer exhaustion clawing at his bones, at his magic, at the very core of him. He had won. But at what cost? His eyes flicked toward the Candlemaker, still standing in the remnants of the ritual chamber, still watching with that unreadable expression. Is it over? Sylas asked, his voice rough, lower than he expected. The Candlemaker's gaze shifted slightly, moving from the flickering candle to Sylas, his expression neither pleased nor displeased, simply knowing. For him? Yes. A pause. For you? That depends. The words sent a flicker of something dark curling in Sylas's stomach. Depends on what? The Candlemaker reached out, fingers trailing idly along the shelf beside him, his touch light, absent-minded, as if considering something. The balance was restored because you invoked it. The weight of the spell had to shift. His silver eyes gleamed in the dim light. But a warlock of your skill should already know, nothing is undone without consequence. Sylas's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching at his sides. I paid my price. Did you? The Candlemaker's voice was soft, thoughtful, but it carried an edge, a weight Sylas did not like. His magic bristled beneath his skin, restless, unsteady, waiting. He did not trust this. He never had. Then why does your mark remain? Sylas frowned, his gaze flicking toward his wrist. His pulse quickened. The sigil was still there. Faint. Weaker. But still there. The remnants of the binding should have vanished the moment Cassiel had taken his place. It should have been erased from him, wiped clean from his soul. But it wasn't. It remained, a ghost of what had been. A scar that had yet to fully close. He lifted his gaze back to the Candlemaker, his stomach twisting. What does it mean? The Candlemaker's expression did not change, but the flickering light cast deeper shadows beneath his features, making him look less like a man and more like something carved from the spaces between. It means your story is not finished, warlock. A pause. It means you are not free. The word settled over Sylas like ice, a weight he had not expected, a whisper of something he had not yet seen, something that had been moving in the background all along. His lips parted, 1,000 questions pressing against his tongue, 1,000 calculations unraveling in his mind, but before he could speak, before he could demand the answers he had already fought so hard to find, the Candlemaker lifted a single hand, and the world around them collapsed. The chamber dissolved, the fire faded, the walls melted into black, and then, nothing. Just the void. Just the unknown. Just the waiting silence of a warlock who had won his battle, but not his war. Chapter 15, The Echoes of the Unfinished. Sylas did not fall. He did not drift. He did not move through the darkness, because there was no movement, no direction, no space to navigate. There was only absence, a hollow, infinite silence that pressed against him, wrapped around him, seeped into him like ink bleeding through fabric. His pulse was steady but slow, his breath non-existent yet present, his body still whole yet untethered, as if existence had become a concept rather than a certainty. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that had led him to this moment, pressed down upon him, but the weight did not suffocate. It simply was, the presence of memory without the presence of time, a reality that existed but was not being experienced. He had won. He had defeated Cassiel. He had done what he set out to do. And yet, he was still here. Still caught between the remnants of one battle and the whisper of something else, something waiting just beyond the veil of understanding, something that had always been lurking in the background, unseen but never absent. The Candlemaker's words lingered in his mind, your story is not finished, warlock, a declaration rather than a warning, a truth rather than a threat. Sylas had spent years unraveling the secrets that led him to this point, years chasing shadows and peeling back the layers of deception, of betrayal, of ancient power disguised as fate. He had thought the answers were finite, that once Cassiel was broken, once Leora was freed, once the balance was restored, the pieces would settle, and the ending would be his to claim. But the mark still burned on his wrist. The ritual had not erased its presence. The fire had not consumed it. It remained, a scar, a tether, a whisper of something unfinished. And the Candlemaker had known. He had always known. Sylas exhaled, or at least he thought he did, though no air moved, no sound was made. He was in the void now. Not dead. Not truly lost. Just waiting. His mind turned over the pieces, assembling them, analyzing them, testing them against the reality he had known, against the rules of magic that had bound him since the day he first touched power. A ritual, by design, was a contract. An exchange. A cycle. The fire that had bound Leora had been passed to him, but he had refused its weight, had forced it onto Cassiel instead. The ritual had been rewritten, the price had been paid, but the remnants of it, the core of it, had not vanished. The original spell had required a warlock's soul to fuel its fire, to keep the cycle intact, to ensure that balance was maintained. And though Cassiel had taken the final fall, though his soul now burned in the cage he had crafted, something had not been severed. The ritual was broken, but its foundation remained intact. The mark on Sylas's wrist was not the binding itself. It was a signature. A link to something deeper, something older, something before Cassiel had even learned to weave the first thread of this curse. Sylas narrowed his eyes against the endless dark, his thoughts sharpening, his instincts pressing against the edges of whatever invisible walls surrounded him. This was not the end. This was a threshold. He was not truly trapped, not in the way Cassiel had intended, not in the way the ritual had originally been designed. He had not become the fire, he had interrupted it. And that meant there was still a door. The weight of the void shifted, an unseen ripple passing through it, not sound, not movement, but recognition. He was not alone here. Something else was aware of his presence, something that had been waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to reach this point, waiting for him to choose. The air, if it could be called that, rippled again, and then a whisper curled through the silence, not from any direction, because there was no direction. The whisper was not spoken. It was simply felt. You see it now. The words did not belong to the Candlemaker, nor to Cassiel, nor to anything he had encountered before. This voice was older. This presence was woven into the ritual itself. Sylas did not flinch, did not react with anger or fear. He had come too far to break now. What am I seeing? He thought, the words shaping themselves without sound, without breath, existing only as intent. The presence stirred, its form unseen, its shape impossible to define. The echo of what remains. The price that was not paid. Sylas's fingers curled slightly, the weight of those words settling into him. I paid it, he thought. Cassiel paid it. Another ripple, a shift, something amused yet devoid of emotion, something that observed rather than judged. Cassiel paid his price. But the fire remains. A warlock's fire cannot be erased, only passed. You passed it to him. But the cycle is not broken. Sylas's breath was steady, his thoughts quick, sharp, methodical. He was being told something. Being offered something. A truth he had not yet grasped. Then tell me what remains. The whisper curled through him again, wrapping itself into his mind, pressing against the edges of his understanding. The first fire. A pause, heavy with meaning. The fire before the candle. Before the bindings. Before the rituals. Another pause. Before him. Sylas felt his pulse quicken, the realization unfurling within him like a chain reaction. This was not just about Cassiel's magic. This was not about the spell he had crafted, the prison he had made, the cycle he had designed. Cassiel had not created this. He had only learned how to wield it. He had only been a vessel, a link in a far longer chain, a warlock who had taken the pieces left behind by something far older and reshaped them into something of his own making. But the first fire remains. And that meant, this was not over. Sylas exhaled slowly, his mind snapping into focus, his body tensing against the nothingness around him. Where does it lead? The whisper thinned, fading, not gone, but retreating into the fabric of the void, leaving only a final answer, a single inevitable truth that settled into his bones, into his blood, into his mark. Find the one who lit it. The world lurched. The void fractured. And Sylas fell. Chapter 16, Into the First Fire. Sylas fell, but there was no sensation of movement, no air rushing past, no force pulling him downward. It was not falling in the way a body moved through space, it was falling through existence itself, through the fabric of reality unraveling around him, through the veil of something before time, before magic as he had known it, before Cassiel, before the candles, before the rituals that had stolen and burned and bound souls for centuries. The voice in the void had not been a warning, it had been an invitation, a demand, a command woven into the very nature of what he had become. Find the one who lit the first fire. That was the answer, the only path forward, the only way to break free from the lingering mark on his wrist, the only way to end this entirely. But the words carried more than just direction. They carried truth. The Candlemaker had been the master of wax and flame, but he had not invented the fire. Cassiel had been the one to turn the binding into a prison, but he had not designed the cycle. There was something older. Something that had always existed. The moment Sylas understood that, the darkness shattered. Light burned into existence, not golden, not warm, but a deep, consuming crimson, thick and alive, swirling like ink in water, moving without direction, shifting without form. It was not fire. It was potential. The raw, untamed energy before it was shaped, before it was given purpose, before it was turned into what it would become. The sight of it sent a sharp, instinctual unease crawling down Sylas's spine. Magic had always followed rules, even the most dangerous, even the most forbidden. But this was something unshaped, something raw, something limitless. He was not supposed to be here. No one was supposed to be here. This was before the first mistake. This was before the first bargain. This was where it all began. And then the presence came. It did not step forward, because there was no distance. It did not emerge, because it had always been here. It simply became visible. A shape formed in the swirling crimson light, neither solid or ethereal, shifting between states, neither man nor shadow, neither mortal or divine. Its edges flickered like flame, yet it cast no heat. Its movements were slow, deliberate, not restrained but precise, as if every motion was a decision, every breath an inevitability, every word spoken an unbreakable truth. And when it spoke, Sylas felt the weight of it press against his ribs, inside his mind, inside his blood, inside the very foundation of his being. You are not the first to come looking for answers. Sylas's pulse remained steady, though his magic coiled inside him, warning, waiting. He had faced warlocks who thought they were gods, demons who had forgotten they were once men, curses older than civilization itself. But this was different. This was something outside of time, something that did not just wield power but was power itself. This was the first flame. He chose his words carefully. And yet, the fire remains. The shape tilted its head slightly, the flickering glow shifting, rippling in the space around it. Of course it does. There is no ending what was never created. Fire does not begin or end. It simply moves from one hand to another. A slow exhale left Sylas's lips, though he still was not entirely sure if he was even breathing in this space. Then tell me who lit it first. Pause. The air stilled. And then, slowly, the first flame laughed. The sound was not human. It was not cruel, not mocking, but something else entirely. It was understanding. It was acknowledgement. It was recognition. And it carried a single, unshakable certainty. You already know. Sylas's fingers curled. The mark on his wrist burned. And for the first time, he felt something inside it shift. A memory that was not his own. A moment that had always existed but had never been seen. And in it, a hand. A single hand reaching forward. A hand that had not yet belonged to anyone. A hand that had not yet been burned. A hand that had been the first to shape the unshaped, to turn potential into something controlled, to bend the fire into something it was never meant to be. And then it took. The first candle. The first binding. The first mistake. Sylas's breath hitched. His mind snapped back to the present, to the shifting glow of the first flame watching him, waiting for him to understand. And he did. Gods help him, he did. The first warlock. His voice was barely a whisper, the truth curling around his throat, strangling, choking, burning. The first to take magic from something beyond them. The first to bind it. The first to shape it. His breath was slow, steady, but his blood ran cold. The first who tried to control fire. The first flame did not nod, did not confirm, did not need to. The answer had already been placed inside him. And Sylas knew, it had never been a single man. It had never been one soul, one being, one mistake. It had been a cycle from the beginning. A cycle that repeated itself over and over, warlocks reaching for power they could not control, shaping fire into something that could be bartered, bound, exchanged. The first warlock had not just created the first curse. He had created the first cost. And that cost had never been paid. Sylas's jaw clenched, his magic pressing against his skin, pulsing against the mark that had never been Cassiel's alone. It never ended, he murmured, more to himself than to the being before him. It just passed from one to another. From one warlock to the next. Cassiel was just another hand holding it. And now, his breath stilled. Now it's mine. The first flame's glow deepened, shifting, curling inward, the weight of its presence pressing against Sylas as if in silent approval. And now you must decide what to do with it. Sylas exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing, his magic humming, his mind racing. He had spent years chasing this curse, thinking he had been hunting its creator, its source, its origin. But there was no origin. There was only fire passing hands. And now, it was in his. The first flame did not speak again. It did not offer him guidance, did not present him with another riddle, did not shape his next step. Because this time, the choice was not written. Sylas had been given what Cassiel had sought. The purest, rawest form of magic. The unshaped fire that could be bound or broken, passed or extinguished. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, the next step was his alone. The fire waited. The cycle waited. And Sylas chose.
Every story has an ending, but some mysteries live on. If you enjoyed this tale, don't let it fade into the shadows. Smash that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will transport you beyond the veil of the ordinary. Subscribe to our channel and your name will appear at the beginning of our next video, where we will pleasantly thank you for your subscribing. Tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments. What twists did you see coming? And what secrets do you think still remain? Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and let the next story begin.